going to help us understand what it is Paul is trying to say when we get into the letter. It's going to become valuable, believe me. And so today we're going to continue with our introduction to the book of Titus by continuing to talk about Titus himself. We started last week the background and setting of the book of Titus, and we were looking at the person to whom the letter is written, Titus. And if you weren't here last week, let me just say this. We're dealing with a remarkable individual. We are absolutely dealing with a remarkable individual. I mentioned last week that his Latin name, his Roman name, Titus, means honorable. And what we saw last week is we saw his very early background, how Paul led him to Christ, how one of the very first things he did at the Jerusalem Council was stand up and imagine again, as I said last week, being a Gentile Christian, new in the faith, and you're standing there with Jesus' 12 apostles and Paul, and they're trying to decide what you should do, and he says, I'm not doing that. I don't need to do that. The gospel's freed me from the things you're taught. And what a remarkable guy right out of the gate. We saw his work in Corinth last week, how Paul sent him to Corinth with some very severe warnings from the Lord. This letter that's been lost to history of the judgment that was coming to Corinth if they didn't repent. Titus was sent to this really what had become a hostile environment for Paul. And he just went faithfully and did what he was told. And then he stayed to see what would come of it. And brought news to Paul that they had repented. We've got about two more highlights this morning that I want to touch on from Titus's life. We're going to look at the collection for Jerusalem and his work on Crete before we just do a real quick, here's what happened at the end of his life as far as we know, right? And so we continue this morning with our study really of the person of Titus as we look at the next sort of big thing that he was used to do, and that was his collection for Jerusalem. Now, early in the book of Acts, or halfway-ish through the book of Acts, in chapter 11, something interesting happens. Some prophets come from Jerusalem. We don't have a map, that's okay. They came from Jerusalem, the church of Jerusalem, up to Antioch. And while they were there, one of the prophets, one by the name of Agabus, he predicts by the Holy Spirit that a famine is coming, and that this famine is going to affect the whole entire world. Well, immediately upon hearing that, the church at Antioch decides to take up a collection and send it to the church in Jerusalem. Now, this is not the collection that Titus is going to be concerned with, right? This is sort of a precursor, if you will. Because the idea here was, well, the prophets have predicted there's going to be a famine. There's no famine yet, but we want to help get ahead of it, okay? And so the church at Antioch, upon hearing there's going to be a famine eventually, decide, well, let's just take up money and send it to Jerusalem now. And they could use it. And boy, could they ever. One of the things that you need to understand as a background to this letter and to Titus' work is what was going on in the church at Jerusalem. Okay? Remember, this is the first church that ever existed, right? The church in Jerusalem, and the gospel spread from there, and churches began to pop up all over the world. But the church at Jerusalem was very unique. It was always very poor, it always struggled, and it always suffered a lot more than the fledgling Gentile churches all over the world. And we can see that early on in the book of Acts. One of the interesting things in chapter 2 and in chapter 4 in the book of Acts, we see that the early church in Jerusalem had to survive by adopting this sort of communal sharing of everything, right? And that wasn't so much an example of the way churches ought to operate as it was a mode of survival. The church of Jerusalem was so poor, even before a famine, that in order to survive, they had to literally take care of each other. And so upon hearing, well, there's going to be a famine that's going to strike the whole world, they knew how hard that was going to hit Jerusalem in particular, and they decided to take up an offering. Well, about 3 years after that prediction, it finally happens. There was a severe crop failure in Egypt, who at that time fed a great part of the world, and famine began to spread from Egypt. And it hit the area around Judea first, and hit it the hardest. Okay? Part of the reason is because Judea, what we call now Israel, right? During the time that Rome ruled the world, it was one little sort of province there, Judea. It had always really, really particularly suffered under the Romans. The Romans, when they took Judea, the first thing they did was destroy all the infrastructure. Then they double taxed them because they were so troublesome all the time. Judea really had nothing to offer. There wasn't a ton of crops. There wasn't a ton of natural resources. And so it was always sort of the pit of the Roman Empire. It's why Roman governors didn't want to go there. And so when this famine hit, it made things doubly hard on Judea and therefore the church at Jerusalem. In fact, Josephus, which is the Jewish historian, records that there was widespread death in the city from people starving to death. And so when this famine does hit, Jerusalem is hit especially hard. Now, let's go back in time to last week just a little bit, to Acts, where we had what I call the Jerusalem Council. Remember, where they had to go to Jerusalem to decide, what are we going to do about Gentiles getting? And the outcome of that, we see in Acts 15, was the apostles wrote a letter saying, okay, well, Gentiles don't need to be saved. Or, I'm sorry, don't need to be circumcised. But we do need them to not eat meat sacrificed to idols, to not eat anything that was strangled, to not eat or drink blood, and to abstain from sexual immorality, because these things are particularly offensive to the Jews. But there was one other outcome of that Jerusalem Council that was sort of a handshake deal that happened behind the scenes. Paul reports in Galatians that when that was over and he was getting ready to leave, the apostles reminded him, hey, you go to the Gentiles. This is absolutely the work you're supposed to be doing. But one of the things we want you to do is remember the poor. Don't forget the poor. Now, that wasn't the apostles asking for money, okay? They weren't saying, hey, the church at Jerusalem is poor, and as you go around to these Gentile churches, y'all have money, collect it, bring. That's not what was happening there. What was happening is that the other apostles were worried that as Paul went to the Gentiles, that helping the poor wasn't going to be as big of an issue as it ought to be among them. Typically, if you pop that map up there, or have you, yeah, okay. Typically, what was going on in Rome is you had, the way the empire was arranged is you had these core provinces, the ones that are sort of close to Italy and then right around the sea there. Those were the core Roman provinces, okay? And they were typically very wealthy. There was a lot of trade going on. There was a lot of resources there. And because those provinces were wealthy, guess what? The people were wealthy. That meant the churches were wealthy. And so the apostles understood that as Paul goes to these Gentile churches, these people are not going to be suffering the same way the church of Jerusalem suffers. These churches are going to comparatively be wealthy. It's not that there was no poverty in Gentile churches. There was some, right? But it wasn't as big an issue. And so the apostles remind Paul, we don't want the Christians' responsibility to the poor sort of falling by the wayside. You need to remember the poor. One of the things we want you to teach these Gentile churches is, because you have money, you're responsible to help the poor. And Paul said, I was happy to do that. In Galatians, I was happy to take that message with you. Now, what does any of that have to do with Titus or what's going on here? Remember I told you that this great famine finally hit, and it hit Jerusalem very hard. And so during Paul's third missionary journey, he sort of launches this massive campaign in these core provinces. Okay, as he's going to churches there, he's telling them, we have decided to start a collection. We want you guys in these Gentile churches who have some money to take up a collection. We need to send it to Jerusalem. They are suffering immensely. They're suffering immensely. Now, eventually, this famine did reach these Gentile churches. In fact, you read in like Philippians in particular, we see that these churches had begun to struggle themselves because of this famine, and it was out of their poverty that they gave to the church of Jerusalem. But Paul had started this collection, if you will, to try and bring some relief to the church of Jerusalem. Now, that's where we wanted to get to. Let's talk a little bit about that. When he decides to start this collection, here's what you've got. You've got to send somebody all over the Roman Empire to collect money, bring it back safely to Paul, all accounted for, so that it can go to Jerusalem. Guess who gets picked to head up that assignment? It's our boy Titus. It's our boy Titus. Paul says this in 2 Corinthians chapter 8. He says that I urged Titus, I urged Titus to sort of take the reins of this thing when he was in Corinth. He informs the Corinthians that he had personally asked Titus to take care of heading up this collection. And then he tells him in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 16 and 17, that Titus is so much like me that he didn't even need to be asked. When he found out this needed to be done, he volunteered to go. He wanted to be the one to come to you guys and to collect this money, and among other things, and to be able to help take it to Jerusalem. And then it's 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and verse 23. He vouches for Titus personally, in case anybody there doesn't know him. Now the point of this is, he's about to send this guy along with a couple of others all over the Roman Empire to Gentile churches to take money from them. Okay? You can see how this could get sticky, right? And he's going to show up with a letter and say, I'm here to get the money, and I'm going to take your money, and you can trust me. I'm going to take it to Paul, and we're going to take it to Jerusalem. Now, we've seen Titus's character already at work with Paul in this study. We know that he's an honorable man. But if you want to know what somebody's really like, put him in charge of money. Right? Put him in charge of money. Or give him money. Think of this situation in Titus's day. Right? They don't have the internet. They don't even have the printing press. Your past doesn't have to follow you around. And if you wanted to go collect up money from all of these churches and then shave your beard and change your clothes and go way up there, nobody would ever know what happened to you or their money. And so this idea that he would be given a mission to go all over the Roman Empire, collect money from churches who were struggling, not misuse any of it, and bring every cent back to Jerusalem to help the poor, there's a certain kind of man needed for this job, right? It's the kind of man that we can implicitly trust. And Paul ends up telling the Corinthians, 2 Corinthians chapter 12, you know, I sent Titus to you to collect this money, and before you think to yourselves, well, what should we give it to him? Let me ask you a question. Has he ever taken advantage of you? He was there when you hated me. Has he ever taken advantage of you? Have I ever used him to take advantage of you? What Paul tells the churches to whom Titus is going is that I have personally asked this man to take care of this because there is no one more like me in the world that I could send to do it. In fact, he's more than my disciple or my helper. He is my equal where this work is concerned. And in dealing with you, I can vouch for the fact, and so can you, that he's never taken advantage of you or anyone else. Here's the point I want to make with all of that background. Titus's character is such that when Paul gives him probably the stickiest assignment he's ever had, right? Other people's money. What Paul is able to do is point back to past dealings with Titus. Part of the reason he knows he's able to appoint him to do this important work is because he can go to these churches and say, what was he like the first time? He's always been the same. He's always had an honorable reputation among you. Now that's going to become important in this letter. Remember I asked you to open to Titus. Let me just give you an example. Look in chapter 1 and verse 7. One of the things that Titus is tasked to do in Crete is appoint church leaders. And he gives them these qualifications here. And he tells Titus, if you're going to appoint an overseer, he must be blameless. He must be blameless. He must be like you. And so we see how Titus's character becomes important to the letter that Paul is going to write it. Okay? Titus has an honorable reputation. And a reputation takes a lifetime to build, but seconds to destroy. There's no shortcuts to a good reputation. You can't be bought. And once you damage it, it's usually irreparable. At this point that Titus gets tasked with collecting this offering, he's been saved at most 12 years at most. And what Paul's able to do to these churches is point back and say, over the past 12 years, have you ever seen him act any other way than honorably in everything he's ever done? And so when the time finally comes for him to take on the most sort of sensitive, important, and really volatile assignment he's ever been given, collecting other people's money, Paul knows there's only one guy I can trust to do. There's only one guy I would ask to do this. And you remember, Paul ran around with Luke, with Timothy, with Barnabas, with Silas, with Mark. But when it comes to probably the most sensitive sort of issue Paul's ever had to deal with, one guy comes to mind. It's our boy Titus, the one we're dealing with in this letter. And the reason is he had developed a reputation for being completely honorable in everything he had ever done. And so Paul understood when it came to taking other people's money, he had earned the opportunity over the course of these 12 years of faithfulness and trustworthiness and dependability. All of these smaller tasks Titus had ever been given to do led up to this great one. Now let me personalize this, all right, and sort of regain your interest. Have any of you ever wondered among yourselves about your own usefulness to God, so to speak? Right? Well, what can he do with me? Why would he do anything with me? Back in Luke chapter 16, Jesus makes a statement in verse 10. I don't think I've got a slide, I don't remember. Where he says, he that is faithful with a little will be what? Faithful with a lot. And I'm paraphrasing here, who's not going to be good with a little, not going to be trustworthy with a little, he also won't be, he'll be the same way if you give him a lot. The principle Jesus was establishing here is the kingdom works like this. Okay? God understands that if I give a man, if I give a woman blessings, right, or an assignment to do, right, or something that I want accomplished in the kingdom, the ones I'm going to be able to trust to do that work are the ones I've always been able to trust to do that work. And Titus exemplifies this idea before us. And the question is, Titus had an honorable reputation in the kingdom. That's what we should be working towards as well. Okay? So let me ask you, sort of put this in the form of some questions. The things that the Lord has given you to do so far, have you done them? Have you done them without wavering? Have you done all of them the best that you could? Have you done all of them without quitting, no matter how hard it got? Have you continued to do them no matter what the outcome was going to be like? Because the answers to those kind of questions will help you determine your usefulness to God going forward. Faithful with a little will be faithful with a lot. That's an inescapable universal principle. And that's the sort of humble faithfulness that leads Titus to the most really notable work he'd be given to do, and the reason we even have this letter. Let's finish up with what he did on Crete. When we get into the book of Titus, you're going to see in verse 4 or verse 5, Paul says, I left you on the island of Crete to accomplish some things. Okay? And the reason he knew he could do that is because of all of his dealings with him so far. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, because Crete's going to be the subject really and content of our entire letter. And I trust really that by now you probably realize the kind of man we're dealing with. Remember last week I said Acts ended with Paul under house arrest in Rome. And the book comes to an end, but the story doesn't. Paul stayed under house arrest about 2 years. When he left, most Bible scholars believe he went to Spain for a couple of years, maybe 3 years at the most. And when he was on his way back from Spain, he stopped at this little island, we don't have a map, but that's okay, called Crete, where he was working with Titus while he was on that little island. Okay? Now, while none of the details of Paul's time in Spain are recorded in Scripture, we definitely know that on his way back, he stopped to work in Crete with Titus. And he's not able to stay very long. We don't know why. He was in Crete probably at most just a few weeks, maybe a month or two at the very most, and he has to leave, and we don't know why. But what he tells Titus in chapter 1 of verse 5, I left you in Crete to finish what I couldn't do. I left you there to finish what I couldn't do. Part of the reason I left you there was to complete the work that was unfinished and to appoint elders in every city. And when we get into the letter, what I want you to keep in mind is this is what Titus was left there to do. Because this is going to keep coming up in this letter because it's important. That's why this background is important. Titus was left alone on Crete by Paul to do work that Paul admits he should have been doing or needed to be the one to do. But Titus was so trustworthy and so wise and so honorable in everything he had ever done, Paul was comfortable leaving him there to do work he himself would have ordinarily done. Now, some of that work included appointing elders in every city. Yeah, there we go. Right? But that isn't all there was to it. He was also there to stop false teachers. He was also there to teach believers how they were to live. He was there to teach believers how they were to relate to the world. And when we start to dig into this letter, this is what I want you to start remembering all this stuff I taught you about Titus the man. Because one of the things you're going to see is the main sort of thought of this letter is that Christians simply must be the people they profess to be. And there was no better example for them than Titus, which is one of the reasons Paul leaves him there. Now, we don't know how successful, so to speak, Titus was on Crete. He probably was at least moderately successful because Paul keeps using him even after the Bible is done with, right? Or the story in the Bible is done with. What we learn is that whatever happened on Crete, Titus eventually left there. Okay? And we know that because in the book of Titus, chapter 3 and verse 12, Paul says, I plan to spend the winter in a city called Nicopolis, and I want you to come here. I want you to leave Crete and come here with me. And so we know Titus eventually left Crete. And we don't know any details about why Paul wanted him there. We can speculate mostly because it was work that he had for him to do in other places. In 2 Timothy chapter 4, and I don't know that I've quoted it, but it's verses 9 and 10 if you'd like to read it. We learn that in about, 66, 67 AD, shortly before Paul was killed, Titus had gone to a place called Dalmatia. You have that map up there? You can see it right up. See it there? Dalmatia. It's interesting because that, at the time, was the edge of the world, literally. It was the very edge of the Roman Empire. It was this mountainous sort of Roman province that was the very edge of the world. Paul says in Romans 15 that he had been up in that area before and had taken the gospel up there. And then nothing else had ever happened. And so one of the things, as I said, we learn from 2 Timothy chapter 4 is very near the end of Paul's life, he pulls Titus off of Crete and he sends him literally to the edge of the world to do the same thing presumably he had been doing in Crete. We believe Titus's final mission was probably a lot like the one he had on Crete, to go to these churches that Paul had established and then had to leave, and they had been out there alone. I mean, completely at the edge of the world to their own devices. And Paul sends Titus out there to do very much the same thing, to take these churches he had planted, to shore them up, to secure them, to appoint leadership, to make sure that everything was going okay. And that's the last place we see Titus in the Bible. His Bible doesn't record Titus' death. The Catholics have a lot of traditions where that's concerned. History doesn't tell us anything about him, but I can tell you what the Catholics say. They say that he did not die as a martyr, that he instead eventually returned to the island of Crete, and he stayed there as a church leader and lived a very long and peaceful life. Catholic tradition says he died about between 94 and 97 years old, right? Peacefully on Crete in the capital city, and that he was buried there, and they eventually supposedly took his head and brought it somewhere else. But that's Catholic sort of stuff. You pop that last slide up there, and that is not a picture of Titus, but that is what the Catholics in the 1400s believed he looked like. That iconography, it all sort of looks the same. Now, let's finish up. So, as I said, one word I want you to take away from learning about Titus the man is this. One word. His name. Honorable. Honorable. Titus was honorable at the Jerusalem Council. He was honorable among the Corinthians. He was honorable when Paul called on him to take up this offering. In all of his travels and all of his assignments, he acted honorably. In Crete, he acted honorably. And so why would we think that he would be anything else when he sent this important letter we're about to study? One of the things that I said we're going to study about this letter is one of the main themes is integrity. Paul is going to go over and over and over back to a Christian must actually live what they say they believe. They must. And who's a better model to represent what that means to us than the guy we've talked about for the past 2 weeks? Titus was this remarkable man, of remarkable character, who Paul was able to do remarkable work with in a very difficult time. He embodies what it means to be faithful with a little, will be faithful with a lot. And as we begin to study the letter itself, your mind will go back to this several times, believe me, as we see that the person that Titus was sort of sets the backdrop for the wider scope of the letter. As a leader and as an example of what he expected the Christians on Crete to become, that's the idea of the book of Titus. Okay? That's the idea that as a Christian, we are all expected to be becoming something more than we are. That's sort of the main thought in Titus. You are expected to be becoming more than you are right now. And how do you do that? By continued faithfulness to whatever God calls you to do, big or small. Do it honorably, do it faithfully, do it until it's done. Do it no matter what the outcome is. That's how you become more as a Christian, and more and more and more all of the time. And this is exactly what God expects of all of us. That when we are faithful with a little, we will be faithful with a lot. And in sort of training us that way, the Holy Spirit makes us more and more and more sort of into the image of Christ, which was the plan from the beginning, according to Romans. And so that is pretty much the biography of Titus, a remarkable, honorable guy that sets the tone for the letter and sets the example for our lives. Let's have a word of prayer, and we'll be dismissed. Next week, Lord's